Our first speaker today is David Fraser, Professor Emeritus in the Animal Welfare Program at the University of British Columbia. David is here to set the scene for this year's seminar by providing us with a short history of animal ethics and a suggestion for a way forward to help us guide us through the complexity of animal welfare issues. Over to you, David.
Hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to be joining you from Vancouver, Canada, and my thanks to the organizers for the opportunity to speak with you today. I've been asked to give a short history of animal ethics. So here's what I'm proposing. I thought we'd start with some traditional views of the human-animal relationship and their ethical implications, then how these ethical ideas relate to more formal categories of ethical theory, then current developments that challenge existing approaches, and finally, propose a direction for the future. But since that all sounds a bit cerebral, let's start with a picture and a story. So here's the picture, a tree and two wispy human figures with a turtle. I don't really expect people in Australia to recognize this straight off, but people in Canada might, because it is the creation story of the Ojibwe and related cultures from the central part of the country. In the story, a princess fell from the sky world down onto the world below, which at the time was completely covered in water. Some wild birds tried to protect her and carry her on their wings, but she was too heavy. Then the turtle came to the surface and said that she could land on his back, whereupon a toad dove down, brought up soil from beneath, spread it on the turtle's back, and it, being a living thing, grew until the woman saw land as far as she could see. This is, the story, of course, comes from a hunting culture where people lived through harsh northern winters in part by hunting animals, and it was one of many stories that reminded them how profoundly their existence depended on the assistance of, even the pity of, other species. All right, a little more familiar picture. This is, of course, the creation story from the first chapter of Genesis. God on the left has already created the world with its plants and animals, and as the towering pinnacle of creation, brings forth the first humans and puts them in charge of the world and the animals, of course, in God's place. This is what we might expect, of course, from a pastoralist culture. And later in the story, when God caused a terrible flood over the world, it was the people who were responsible for protecting the animals from drowning, which is roughly the opposite of how the Ojibwe saw that relationship. Well, each of these different worldviews was accompanied by different ethical ideas about the proper conduct of people toward animals. In the 1930s, anthropologist Frank Speck spent time with the Innu people, then called Naskapi, in the forests, not the Arctic, but the forests of northern Canada, in a culture that was largely untouched by colonial contact. And he recorded the lengths that people went to avoid causing offense to the animals that they had killed, especially bears, which were the most important food. So to avoid offending the bear's tail would not be cut off, the right arm and paw would not be severed, the meat would not be eaten outdoors because that would be too informal. And at the end, the bear's skull was carefully cleaned, erected on a pole so that the bear could continue to see, and provided with gifts. And this was thought to make peace with the bear so that bears would not take offense and refuse to cooperate in future hunts. So these practices toward animals reflect the view of animals as important fellow citizens, often better adapted than humans are, and that need to be shown proper gratitude and respect. Right. The pastoralist ethic of the Bible included at least two elements that guided how people should deal with animals. First, it allowed animals to be used for certain purposes as long as the appropriate conventions were observed. Secondly, it attached great importance to the diligent care of animals. So, looking after animals was one of the few tasks that was permitted on the Sabbath when other work wasn't allowed. Animals had to be fed and watered and nursed back to health. And of course, protecting animals from danger was very revered. The great King David, the first sign that he would make a great king of the people was his care in protecting the family's sheep. And of course, the metaphor of the diligent shepherd caring for sheep was so positive that it was often used to represent divine love. Well, the animal ethics of the Innu and the biblical pastoralists were at least in part what we might call relational ethics, where our duties to others flow from the relationship we have with them. So shepherds must care for their sheep, and the Innu must give gifts to the bears that they had killed. And relational ethics remain deeply influential today, so most dog owners feel a duty to feed their dog, but not somebody else's dog, or provide food for dogs in faraway countries. Right. During certain periods, however, of more, especially more urban living, a very different approach to ethics developed. Here's a wonderful book called Animal Minds and Human Morals, The Origins of the Western Debate by classicist Richard Sorabji, which documents the complex debate about the moral status of animals that occurred in ancient Greece. There, the key question is whether the principles of justice that we apply to fellow humans also apply to animals. For some philosophers, such as Pythagoras, animals are so similar to people that, of course, the principles of justice apply. Hence, for the followers of Pythagoras, as reported later by the poet Ovid, it is wicked as human bloodshed to draw the knife across the throat of the calf, which is roughly what we see today in some modern slogans. However, Aristotle had concluded that although animals are very like humans in many respects, they do not have logos or reason. The Epicureans, who emphasized a happy, wholesome life as the basis of morals, regarded justice as a kind of contract to avoid causing and being caused harm. But they considered that because animals don't have reason, they can't enter into this kind of contract and therefore fall outside of moral consideration. And this was followed by debates over centuries about the true mental powers of animals, and hence whether the principles of justice apply to them. The debates were complex, and reading Sorabji, I found it hard to think of any modern animal rights argument or counter-argument that wasn't present or at least anticipated in ancient Greece. All right, so here was a rule-based approach, sometimes called a deontological approach to animal ethics. The Greeks had rules about how they should treat other people, and the key issue was whether these rules applied to animals as well. Very different approach, sometimes called virtue ethics, has emerged at different times, but let me use England in the 1700s as an example. During the 15 and 1600s, acts of cruelty to both people and animals were exceedingly common in England. Hot iron branding of vagrants was common. Numerous public executions of criminals, all manner of ill treatment of animals. Around 1750, the artist William Hogarth, taking issue with these issues, did what he called the 4 stages of cruelty. And here's his second stage. Here on the bottom left, we see a callous cart driver who is beating a delicate horse who is unable to pull a carriage overloaded with fat lawyers. Further back, we have someone goading an overloaded donkey, and way at the reverse is the old sport of bull baiting, where dogs are being set on a tethered bull. Then at the front, in the bottom right, we see a man clubbing a sheep on his way to the slaughter plant. And just above him, to introduce the point that harms to animals go hand in hand with harms to people, Hogarth has included a careless cart driver who is about to run over a fallen child. Concerns over this kind of behavior led to a desire to improve the moral tone of society by encouraging virtues such as kindness and stamping out vices such as cruelty. An early exponent of this was the 3rd Earl of Shaftesbury, who wrote, this was in 1713, "To delight in the torture and pain of other creatures indifferently, natives or foreigners, of our own or another species, kindred or no kindred, known or unknown, this is wholly and absolutely unnatural, as it is horrid and miserable." So here the focus is on improving the moral tone of society by stamping out the vice of cruelty. And this became the goal of a whole social movement for animals, not expressly for the protection of animals, certainly not for the welfare of animals, but for the prevention of cruelty to animals. And that, I think, became the chief focus of animal-related laws and societies throughout the 1800s and beyond. So here we have a virtue-based approach to ethics, where good conduct toward animals is that which is motivated by virtues such as kindness and compassion, and bad conduct is what is motivated by a vice such as cruelty. Later in the 1700s, another theme came into play in English thought. With the rational thinking of the Enlightenment, Jeremy Bentham and others tried to outline a rational basis for moral decisions. And he saw maximizing happiness and minimizing suffering as the fundamental principle for ethics. So we should judge an action not by whether it conforms to traditional teachings, but by whether it achieved the greatest happiness for the greatest number. And even as he wrote this introduction to the principles of morals and legislation, he recognized, only in a footnote, mind you, but it was there, that this also applies to animals. And the famous quote is, the question is not, can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? So here was an approach to animal ethics based not on virtuous motives or traditional relationships, but on the consequences of an action, whether it promotes happiness and prevents suffering. Well, despite those philosophical developments from Bentham and others, I would say that prevention of cruelty remained the dominant theme in the animal protection movement throughout the 1800s and beyond. But by the mid-1900s, we began to see consequentialism emerging as a major emphasis. A major influence was Ruth Harrison's book, Animal Machines, 1964, which alleged that harms to farm animals were happening on a huge scale, not because farmers are cruel people, but simply by the pursuit of normal business goals of profitability and efficiency. So here the emphasis was on the consequences for the welfare of the animals. And with this, I would say that the animal protection movement largely expanded from an emphasis on acts of cruelty, which remained, of course, a concern, to include the welfare or well-being of the animals themselves. All right, so just to recap, moral philosophers often speak of 4 different types of ethics: relational, deontological, virtue-based, and consequentialist. Relational, shown by the traditional pastoralists and the Innu people; deontological, that we saw in Greece and now in many debates; a virtue-based ethic that we see in Shaftesbury and the anti-cruelty movement; and a consequentialist ethic that we see in Jeremy Bentham and the Societies for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. And these remain very influential today. So relational ethics, I would say, is particularly dominant with people and pets. For deontological ethics, I think the bans on great apes in research and bans on cetaceans in captivity that we see in some jurisdictions are really based on the fundamental idea that it is wrong to use these animals in these ways. Virtue-based ethics, I think we still see very much in some animal protection work, promoting kindness to animals. And of course, I think consequentialist ethics are very much there in the farm animal welfare programs. Now, while all this was happening, another set of concerns about human behavior toward animals arose, especially in the late 1800s. A key event in North America was the hunting of the bison, from populations way up in the millions down to a few hundred survivors, and the hunting of passenger pigeons from a population probably in the billions down to complete extinction. And events such as this led to wildlife conservation emerging as another important theme having to do with human behavior regarding animals. But here the focus was quite different. So conservation was focused on wild animals exclusively, whereas traditional animal ethics tended to look more at captive animals. Conservation was concerned about populations, ecological systems, and species, where traditional animal ethics was concerned about the treatment of individuals. Conservation tried to maintain biodiversity, prevent extinction, maintain ecological integrity, whereas traditional animal ethics was trying to prevent suffering or promote quality of life or promote freedom from interference and so on. So in conservation and animal ethics, the thinking and the social movements for many decades seemed quite separate. I would say in the past century, we've seen a new set of conservation issues, which are also animal ethics issues of the first order. And let me just take three quick examples. As a child growing up, I lived close to Lake Erie, which is the 10th largest surface of fresh water in the world. It had been a rich and diverse ecological system, but by the time I began seeing the lake in the 1950s, scenes like this had become familiar because the lake was so heavily polluted, especially from agricultural runoff, that we saw a massive death of animals through suffocation and through starvation and the collapsing ecological systems. For those of us accustomed to seeing this kind of process, the algae and so on, in small farm ponds, it was shocking to see this in a water body the size of Lake Erie. Today, this is now happening in areas of ocean, commonly called coastal dead zones. And one review concluded that dead zones have now been reported in 400 systems, affecting a total area of more than 245,000 square kilometers. That's the size of a middle-sized country, and causing mass mortality, especially through suffocation. Well, with an Australian audience, I don't need to explain that this is a photograph of an introduced species which went on to cause massive harms to natural systems and a huge number of animals. Harmful introductions are now a pretty much worldwide phenomenon with far-reaching effects, but some would argue that the most harmful invasive animal is actually this species, partly because it is so universal. One attempt to estimate the magnitude of the problem looked at data from the United States and concluded that free-ranging domestic cats kill 1.4 to 3.7 billion birds and 6.9 to 20.7 billion mammals annually in the United States. And just one more example, of course, climate change and its downstream effects, such as extreme weather and coastal flooding, are having profound effects on animals. In one recent attempt to predict the future effects, Chris Thomas and a large team applied mid-range climate warming scenarios to a wide range of species and regions, and predicted on the basis of mid-range climate warming scenarios for 2050 that 15 to 37% of species in our sample of regions and taxa will be committed to extinction. Now, the extinction of species is sometimes seen as a problem of conservation rather than a problem of animal ethics. But driving a species to extinction and all that that entails for the individuals, their ability to reproduce, to find mates, to find food, and so on, this is clearly an issue of animal ethics of the first order. All right, so there are three examples only of harming animals by disturbing the life-sustaining processes and balances of nature through pollution, invasive species, and climate change, and of course, many, many others. And I think we are now starting to see these emerging as issues of conservation concern and of animal ethics concern, although the animal ethics side is being, I think, a little slow to catch up. But conservation and animal ethics concerns don't always go hand in hand. In the 1970s, I did some research on this species and focused partly on highway collisions involving moose. And I found that the extreme use of highway de-icing salt on Canadian highways was creating an irresistible attraction for moose in the springtime when they go in search of extra sources of sodium salts. This wasn't of much conservation interest because moose are not endangered and the mortality rate wasn't high enough to be a major driver of populations. But I saw the dreadful effects that it was having on the animals themselves. And this focused my interest in the whole issue of our car-based transportation system and how it affects other species. The effects are vast, but if we just focus on the collisions and deaths themselves, I think one good review came from Richard Foreman and Lauren Alexander some years ago, who concluded that cars and vehicles must kill about 1 million vertebrates per day in North America alone. So the level of injury and death is very large, even though the issue is not a major conservation concern and frankly hasn't attracted that much attention from animal ethicists. Second example, do you recognize this image? This is a poster made of dead birds who had been collected after colliding with office towers in Toronto, prepared by a wonderful organization called the Fatal Light Awareness Program, aiming to bring attention to the problem of bird window collisions. The individual who's done the most to understand this issue is Daniel Clem, who, after decades of research, concluded windows and other reflective and transparent surfaces likely kill 1 billion birds each year in the United States and billions worldwide. And his work dispelled the myth that these collisions lead to a quick and painless death through a broken neck. Clem's post-mortem work showed that in many cases, this was a slow death caused by cerebral hemorrhage or a death by starvation after the bird's bill had been broken. And Daniel also described the trouble he had getting ornithologists to pay any attention to the issue because many of the species were not of conservation concern and prominent animal ethicists have been very silent. Well, in Australia, I hope people will recognize this individual, the Scottish poet Robert Burns, out ploughing a field, who in a famous poem is apologizing to this individual, the mouse, for having caused its almost certain death by ploughing up its nest late in the year. Ploughing, of course, today is done on a very different scale than it was in Burns' time, and we may wonder what effects it and other cropping operations may have on animals. The most abundant mammal in farmland in many continents is this species, the common vole. German scientist Jens Jacob studied populations of voles before and after ploughing and other field operations. He concluded that plowing is the most destructive, and specifically that after plowing, common vole numbers dropped from about 90 per hectare to about 0, almost certainly from mortality, not from movement. Now, we don't know how typical these numbers are, but if we apply them to the 1.4 billion hectares of arable land in the world, then the rate of injury and death from cropping operations must be simply staggeringly high. And again, these are not of much conservation concern because most of the animals affected are not rare. And there has been very little attention to this from animal ethics. All right, so here we see these unintended harms: vehicle collisions, windows, cropping operations, lots more, communication towers, fisheries bycatch, ghost fishing, pesticide drift, where just our manner of living is having a profound effect on other species, but these harms fall largely outside the realm of conservation and rarely seem to make it into discussions of animal ethics. My conclusion is that we are in a century when the harms we are causing to other animals are extremely complex and varied, and that none of the approaches to animal ethics, relational, rule-based, virtue-based, consequentialist, or conservationist, seem to be providing the whole range of guidance that we need. However, when people are involved in complex real-life situations, they often develop an approach that might be called practical ethics or practice-focused ethics. Here I was inspired by philosopher Stephen Tolman's book called Cosmopolis, in which he described practical philosophy as contextual more than theoretical, so rooted in an understanding of how people actually live rather than in ethical theory. Timely rather than timeless, that is, designed to deal with current problems, not necessarily capture eternal truths. And reasonable more than rational, that is, it would give sensible guidance for real-life experience rather than being deduced from some foundational principle. I guess the classic example of practical ethics would be medical ethics, which generally revolves around 4 mid-level principles: to do good to patients, beneficence; to do no harm to patients, non-maleficence; to treat patients fairly or justice; and to respect patients' own wishes, such as autonomy. Now, of course, these principles can come into conflict. Doing good to patients may sometimes conflict with respecting their autonomy, and so on. And the task of practical ethics is not to deduce correct action from some single foundational principle, but to decide how best to apply and balance the different valid principles through a process of discussion and reflection. So my question to you is whether we could develop a practical ethic for animals that is contextual and timely and reasonable. I return to this question over and over, but let me offer one possible version. As a first principle, I would suggest to provide good lives for all the animals that we take into our care. Now, of course, people will disagree about what constitutes a good life for animals. And it won't always be possible to provide good lives for all the animals in our care, just as it isn't always possible to be beneficial to all patients. But I see this as a fundamental goal for animal ethics. Second, to protect the life-sustaining processes and balances of nature. This, of course, is fundamental to conservation, but I also think it is fundamental to the ethics of all of the actions that we make that affect animals. Third, to be mindful of the harms that we cause and minimize them as much as we can. Here we recognize that we cannot house and feed billions of people in the world without causing a great deal of harm to the other inhabitants. But if we are mindful of the harms and motivated to minimize them, there are often measures we can take to reduce the amount of harm. The problem is that we, in many cases, are not mindful of them, and don't make a serious effort to mitigate them. And finally, to respect those human-animal relationships that allow people and animals to live together sustainably. So this principle recognizes and affirms the positive relationship that many people have with animals. It also recognizes the kind of social contract embedded in the pastoralist ethic of traditional herders and in those indigenous cultures where the culture allowed people to live in sustainable relationships with animals and the environment for millennia. So here is one attempt then to generate a practical ethic for animals based on these principles to provide good lives for all animals that we take into our care, to protect the life-sustaining processes and balances of nature, to be mindful of the harms that we cause and minimize them as much as we can, and to respect those human-animal relationships that allow people and animals to live together sustainably. My question to you is whether something like this, but improved by those of you who are more rooted in certain areas of practice than I am, could provide the practical animal ethic that I think we need for the future. And for those of you who are interested, a lot of what I've said today is contained in the new edition, the 2023 edition of this book, Understanding Animal Welfare, and in these two papers, which I would be happy to send you if you drop me an email. Thank you very much.
And Professor David Fraser now joins us live from Vancouver. Hello, David, and welcome.
Thank you. Are you hearing me all right?
I can hear you fine. I can see that my camera's not working, which is not very sure why, but we'll work on that. It doesn't stop me from asking you some great questions that have come through the chat. So thank you very much for your presentation. And it's given us a better understanding of how the various formal animal ethics theories have emerged. And the way forward seems to be a more practical approach to guide us through some very complex ethical challenges that face the world today. As I said, we do have some fantastic questions that have come from our audience in the chat. So I am going to just pull those up. Sorry, just give me one moment. There are so many questions, I'm having to open it up on a separate screen, which is a great thing, a great problem to have. I will get started with, oh, sorry, here we go. No, sorry, technical glitches always. Emily says, thank you very much for the crash course in ethics. I'm wondering if you can comment on the difference of attitudes toward the killing of animals, particularly animals for food, between relational and deontological ethics.
Yes, okay. For the relational ethics, I use two examples, and of course there's tons of others, but a hunting culture where animals can be killed but have to be shown appropriate gratitude and respect, versus a pastoralist culture where animals can be owned and traded, but following certain rules, and they can be slaughtered for food, but that has to be done in a ritually correct way, and so on. So we've got very different approaches to the killing of animals for food, depending on what the relationship is in that culture. I think that then comes into conflict with people whose relation to animals is entirely focused on pets, for example, where the idea of actually going out and killing an animal is an abhorrent idea. So at the level of relational ethics, we've got a lot of potential conflict from different cultures, using cultures in a very broad sense. Then, of course, all of that can conflict with those using a deontological approach if they feel that the basic principles of justice and equality apply to other species as well, in which case it is simple speciesism, as bad as racism, if we discriminate or use or certainly kill other animals. So we've got very conflicting views coming in from the different ethical viewpoints. And this was one example of why I have gone in the direction of a practical approach to ethics, meaning one based on not one single foundational principle, but a number of valid mid-level principles that we then have to balance out.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll move on to the next question. Can you perhaps share with us how we can best utilize ethics when considering introduced species? I'm sorry, my screen is really messing up with me. So when considering introduced species are controlled, which has a welfare benefit to other species, but often the methods used can cause individual harm to the introduced species or the individual animal that's being controlled. There obviously seems to be a bit of a trade-off. So how do you think we can best use ethics to consider that?
Yeah, okay. Totally a trade-off, as you rightly say. The mid-level principles that I put up, one is to protect the processes and balances of nature. And that's what people are trying to do in eliminating an introduced species that is severely jeopardizing the balances of nature. On the other hand, we want to be mindful of the harms that we're causing. And so by all means, if it isn't, it's a matter then of balancing. How do we protect the life-sustaining processes and balances of nature, while at the same time being mindful of the harms that we're causing? And there's no simple answer there. It would be a matter of people who know the situation, meeting and discussing it and coming up with as much as they can of a consensus.
Thank you, David. Another question here. A great deal of legislation, especially in Australia, still classifies animals as property. Though primary legislation about animal welfare is increasingly recognising their sentience, do you think a legal move away from animals being classified or falling under property is an important step in order to support better ethics and superior animal welfare outcomes, especially in legal proceedings and the ethical frameworks used in those spaces? And I will note, this topic will probably come up later today with one of our other speakers, but we thought it'd be interesting to get your perspective.
Okay. Just try to, can you give me a shorter version, just a summary of that question again, just so we've all got it in our minds?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a typical example that often comes up in a legal situation is that a dog would be considered property under law, and therefore, in a practical sense, if there was a battle of, say, a divorce or family court proceeding, then the owner of the animal will get the animal without the welfare necessarily being prioritised. And so at the moment, that classification of the dog, just like a car or a house, as property, could be perceived to be a barrier to ensuring the best welfare for that dog in those decision making.
Right. Okay. Good. Very important question. Our culture is largely, I think, derived from a pastoralist background. So the Bible came from a pastoralist culture, and it informs a lot of what we do at a very basic level, such as that it is okay to own animals and use them for our purposes, as long as we do it in certain ways. It's hard for us to break out from that and do things like considering animals to be nobody's property, or that certain principles that apply to humans should also apply to animals. We're breaking into that area when we, for example, ban all use of great apes in research, as I think New Zealand has done, and if I'm not mistaken, and the Netherlands. And then in Canada recently, we just said, no more cetaceans in captivity. This is not a species that should ever be kept in captivity because they have a right to be free. So here we broke out from the biblical, it's okay to own animals mentality, and in those cases said, no, there are some fundamental rights for those species that we are going to respect. I think we will continue in a small way to expand the number of species and situations that we treat in that kind of deontological way. But it's tough going for a culture like ours, unlike, say, the Jains in India, where the ownership of animals has been taken for granted for millennia.
Okay, thank you. That's definitely a tricky one. It'll be really interesting to see. I know there is a lot of work happening at looking into that legal aspect. We'll move on to the next question. Your practical approach seems to rely heavily on consequential principles, which have been dominating the approach in the last century, and the times when we see them to be causing the most damage. These seem great in theory, but do you have any ideas why consequentialism seems to have failed us so far in animal ethics?
Okay. I don't think that what I was proposing was necessarily consequentialist. That's an interesting comment by the questioner, and I'd like to go back in the quiet of time and think that through. Certainly one of the principles that I put up there was to respect the traditional relationships that allow people and animals to live in have allowed people and animals to live in sustainable relationships for very long times. So this would be respecting, for example, Aboriginal, in the case of North America, our indigenous cultures and the relationship they have had to animals that is so superior in many respects to the relationship that our culture has had with animals. Ours having caused an ecological disaster in just a few centuries, theirs having been sustainable for millennia. So no, I don't feel that the four principles that I had put up are specifically consequentialist, although there certainly are consequentialist elements there, by all means.
Okay, thank you very much. I am going to squeeze at least one more question in. Do you think sentience matters in the way we treat animals?
Yes, well, yes. How could it not? Specifically, this is of concern in a consequentialist ethic, where if you have a non-sentient being such as a plant, if we can assume that a plant is non-sentient, then it's all right for us to treat it in certain ways that wouldn't be all right for animals. So certainly for a consequentialist approach, sentience is absolutely central. I would say also, my guess is that some of the relational ethics also would depend greatly on the sentience of the animals. And one of my concerns is how little sentience we ascribe to fish, and therefore the ways that we use to capture and kill fish would not be in any way acceptable for if we did the same kind of thing to mammals. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I think
yes.
that's a really interesting and developing area, isn't it? It's not very well known by the general public yet, I don't think, around the sentience of fish, and it'll be interesting to see where that goes in the next few years or so.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, I think we have run out of time for questions, and I really apologise to our audience because I can see that there are a lot more questions coming through. So it's a great start to the seminar, and I very much appreciate you attending today, David. Thank you very much, and hopefully you'll be able to stay on for some of the other talks this afternoon, although I appreciate the time difference is probably a challenge. But thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I apologise to everyone. I'm still having some technical difficulties. We're going to try and sort that out so we can have some more video working. But in the meantime, up next we have Dr. Tim Dean, who is a senior philosopher at the Ethics Centre in Sydney. Tim will be presenting on how we can navigate discussions with people who have a different ethical viewpoint to our own. So thank you, Tim.